Welcome everyone to this afternoon's talk. My name is Mason Jones, and I am a first-year PhD student with CAFE here at the University of Maryland's iSchool. Before we begin with our speaker, I'd like to talk a little bit about CAFE, who we are and what we do. The Center for Archival Futures, or CAFE, is a relatively new iSchool center which started up in January of this year. We're a group of interdisciplinary researchers from the iSchool and beyond whose work intersects at archives and digital curation, but very broadly conceived. We are interested in the systems, processes, and institutions that care for and enable the use of digital objects and data over time. The various projects that fall under CAFE's umbrella take a wide range of human-centered approaches to understanding topics, including data and communities, knowledge ecosystems, and the life cycles of data. Each month during the semester, we host speakers who are at the cutting edge of archives and digital curation research and practice in a wide variety of institutions. You can find recordings of our previous illustrious guest speakers at the CAFE event page. Today's event is off cycle for our speaker series, which is usually the first Wednesday of the month. It is also particularly exciting, though, because it features one of our own affiliate faculty. Today, I'm delighted to introduce this evening's CAFE speaker, Professor Matthew Kirschenbaum. Professor Kirschenbaum is a professor of English and Digital Studies here at the University of Maryland and is an affiliate faculty member of UMD's iSchool. He is also the co-founder and co-director of Book Lab, as well as director of the Graduate Certificate in Digital Studies here at UMD. Professor Kirschenbaum's award-winning research engages topics of digital storytelling, textual studies, authorship studies, and more. His most recent book, Bitstreams, The Future of Digital Literary Heritage, discusses the issues and opportunities for textual studies and book history in the digital age. Thank you, Professor Kirschenbaum, for speaking with us today, and I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks so much, Mason. Thank you, and thanks also to Victoria and CAFE for the invitation. It's always great to talk to my iSchool colleagues. Yeah, a couple of things. So this is I was asked to speak, I think, for about 30 minutes, and then to sort of transition to Q&A. So I'll try to keep to that. The book talk is kind of a funny genre. So the focal point for this afternoon is my recently published book, Bitstreams. It's entitled The Future of Digital Literary Heritage. I mentioned to Victoria before we got started that the section I would be reading from is entitled Archives Without Dust. So I think it will be appropriate for CAFE. But I was saying the book talk is kind of a funny genre, I've learned, because on the one hand, it's part marketing opportunity. The idea is to convince people to buy the book. On the other hand, it's very much also a kind of artifact of academic discourse, wherein the purpose of the book talk is to save other people from the trouble of having to read the book. So it's a somewhat self-conflicted genre, but I'll do my best. So I'm going to talk for a little bit and then actually read a little bit from the book, just a couple of pages to give you some flavor for the prose, and then I will we can open it up for questions and discussion. Let me go ahead and share my screen. And let me say too, I find it tricky to monitor the chat while I'm also speaking. So definitely, please populate the chat with questions and comments, but I don't think I'll be sort of checking in on it until after we pause. As I mentioned, the book is out. It's been out for about a month, about 6 weeks now, actually, and happy to say the reviews are starting to come in, as you can see here. This is somebody on Twitter whose dog got at it, and I was told that it chews very well. So I was pleased to hear that. The book is also, it was occasioned by a set of lectures I was invited to give all the way now back in 2016 at the University of Pennsylvania, the Rosenbach lectures in bibliography. And I mention this because really I know people think of my work as digital humanities or digital studies, which of course it is, but this is also very much a book that's grounded in the academic discipline of bibliography. Now, this is a word which I am always careful about using, particularly in the presence of students. When I utter the word bibliography, they tend to head for the exits because many of us have unpleasant associations with bibliographies. We associate a bibliography with a list of books, a list of works cited that are your sources at the end of an article, a paper, a book, and so forth. And this is indeed one of the practices of bibliography, what's called enumerative bibliography, making lists of books, which is a kind of venerable scholarly practice and practice of librarianship that's existed for centuries. But the word itself, bibliography, is literally writing about books, book writing, bibliography. And as an academic discipline, bibliography also names a set of practices and applied methodologies that in essentially a kind of forensic process seek to uncover the hidden histories, if you will, of books as physical objects they're making. So bibliographers will sometimes famously decline to read a book they are studying because they don't want to be distracted by the content. They want to focus on the book's physicality as a material object, and thereby answer questions about how that object was made, where the paper came from, how it was bound, who did the typesetting, what accounts for differences between different printings and editions, all of those kinds of questions. So that is a kind of more expansive kind of view into what academic bibliography is. And in ways that are, to me, quite thrilling, it really serves as a kind of time travel, almost a kind of wormhole into the past, as you find yourself following in the footsteps of, say, compositors who may have been working in a particular London print shop 300 years ago and sort of recreating aspects of their daily practice so as to understand how the book in your hands came to exist as an object. That said, Bitstreams is not a book about old books. It's a book about much more recent books as well as things digital. So the bitstream of my title, and I know most everyone has seen this very famous diagram, which comes to us from Claude Shannon, who's the mathematical theory of communication, 1948 is the original date. And this is the kind of archetype for how we think about signal transmission, communication in a kind of digital and applied engineering context. What I think, and famously in Shannon's theory, the meaning of a message was a whole separate question. It was sort of independent from questions about the underlying integrity of that message. Did the signal come through intact? Again, this is all very familiar ground. What I've never seen anybody remark upon, for all the times I've seen this particular diagram reproduced, I've never seen anyone remark on the fact that the middle box is the only one that is not labeled. And if you read Shannon's text, it's clear that what this middle box stands in for is what he refers to in the text as, quote, the mere medium, or the channel. And so he's talking in this case about the materiality of whatever medium is transmitting the signal, whether it's routers and servers moving packets through the internet, whether it's telegraph cables, whether it's a book from many centuries ago that is speaking to us now. The mere medium, the medium in its physical materiality, is represented in the diagram through this box through which all signals and noise flow. But curiously, and this is a kind of bibliographical observation, it is the only feature in the diagram that is not explicitly labeled by Shannon. So I was struck by that. To me, it suggested that the medium, the question of media and materiality, as we would say in the English department, is one that we can deconstruct. It's present clearly throughout the whole of Shannon's schema, but in weird ways, it's not acknowledged or represented, at least not in the same manner as other aspects of his system or model. So this is the jumping off point for Bitstreams, this observation about a very famous diagram. And the question that I try to answer in the book, I mean, it's really the question I've been working on for my whole career, these last 20 years at Maryland. And I should say too, the book is dedicated to my colleagues and students here at the University of Maryland. So in a sense, it's dedicated to all of you. And that was an important gesture for me, just because I felt like this book marked a kind of certain moment in my career. I've been here at the university for 20 years, and it seemed like the thing to do. That's an aside. So the question the book seeks to answer, and that I've been seeking to answer, is how can we think and talk about the materiality of digital media? And more specifically, in this instance, how can we use some of the tools, but in particular, the spirit, the ethos of bibliography, this intensive kind of just, overarching scrutiny of the physicality of what Shannon glossed as the mere medium. How can we use that as a way into questions about digital materiality? And this is a question, I'm not the only sort of scholar in digital studies and digital humanities who is sort of thinking about this and working on this, but there are two sort of specific kind of refinements to more general arguments about digital materiality that I try to make. The first, so this is me using a kind of a paper clip to kind of tease open a cranky CD-ROM drive on an old Apple laptop, and you can see the power cord there, which I love the fact that it lights up like that. It's a wonderful image. There's power. There's like electrons are coursing through that cord, but it's worn and it's frayed. It looks a little bit precarious. And what I love about this image is that it really sort of encapsulates for me one of the core arguments of the book, which is that the materiality of digital media, whether we're talking about actual hardware, as we see here, or whether we're talking about software, file formats, standards, and protocols, which may appear at a glance to be a sort of neutral technological phenomena that are kind of evacuated of human context and culture and meaning, but these things all come from somewhere. Standards, protocols, file formats, they don't just manifest out of nowhere. So they too have their own social and cultural materiality. So the argument in the book is that we preserve the bitstream. And I realize I'll gloss the word bitstream in a moment, but we preserve the bitstream not despite its underlying materiality, but precisely because of it. So in this instance, this worn cable and this kind of beat up old Apple laptop, as sort of precarious as it appears, nonetheless, this is our only hope of accessing data from past generations of users. We preserve the bitstream not despite its underlying materiality, but because of its underlying materiality. The materiality of hardware and software gives us our points of access, whereas preservationists and archivists, we can then seek to responsibly intervene and capture that bitstream for posterity. And the word bitstream, which I've been using, and of course it's the title of the book, you will know that bitstream is it's a kind of term of art in computing. A bitstream is a contiguous sequence of bits, of ones and zeros. So a file, for example, is a bitstream, and I'm certainly using the term in that sort of more specific sense in the book, But I also mean Bitstream to be a kind of stand-in for just the general sense that we're kind of awash in the proverbial sea of information. We're surrounded by Bitstreams crisscrossing and kind of weaving in and out of so many aspects of our day-to-day. So this is one kind of core tenet of the book, that materiality is not a problem to be out-engineered. It is precisely that which affords us any possibility, any hope at all of maintaining access to a past in its digital form. The other kind of underlying argument of the book is that we can and should and need to, we can begin historicizing questions about digital archives and digital preservation. And what I mean by that is there's a tendency, so there's a lot of discourse nowadays about a digital dark ages. That's a popular buzzword. Vint Cerf likes to use it. People talk about the digital dark ages, digital vellum, all of these weird sort of medievalisms that cluster around that use of the digital. But there's a tendency in discussions like that, and I think this is actually dangerous from a kind of policy standpoint, to assume that all things digital are created equal, precisely because of sort of the perception of the underlying sort of homogeneity of the bitstream. Everything is just ones and zeros, right? Well, not so much. This is what you're looking at. The image is an article that was published in 1971. And it's entitled On the Reading of Very Old Magnetic Tapes. And so in 1971, there was already a research literature that was characterizing certain earlier generations of magnetic tape as very old, right? And so what I have arrived at in my own sort of practice, if you will, because I also do sort of hands-on work in digital preservation and forensic computing, there are meaningful distinctions to be made about different historical moments in hardware and software development. So I'm a kind of optimist in the sense that I think there's at least a kind of chronological sweet spot from, say, around the year 1980 or the end of the 1970s into at least the early 2000s, the early aughts. The storage media that was in use at the time, or if we're talking about floppy disks, obviously, we're talking about hard drives, CD-ROMs, some slightly more exotic things like Jazz and zip drives, right? We all remember this stuff. Archivists have reasonably good solutions at hand for capturing data from most all of those devices. The proverbial shoebox full of floppy diskettes that lands on an archivist's desk is no longer, I think, or certainly it needn't be, the kind of nightmare scenario that it might have once been. All right, how will we ever read this? The means for doing that are actually fairly trivial. There was just a there was a fun episode on Twitter just in the last week where floppy disks that were mailed out to news outlets and people covering the music industry when Prince changed his name to the glyph, the symbol. Publishers, printers needed a way to represent Prince's new name, his new identity as that glyph, that symbol. They needed the actual digital typeface for it. And so the digital font was mailed out to publications throughout the world sometime in the 1990s, I forget the date. And those diskettes that have the original digital incarnation of the Prince glyph have since become sort of collector's items. And so Anil Dash, who some of you may know as a kind of tech influencer and entrepreneur, donated his to the Internet Archive, where they read the data back from it, and the glyph is now available. And in fact, we 3D printed the glyph at Book Lab the other day. But my point is there's this kind of sense of wonder and curiosity around the notion that we're reading data from a floppy disk that's, say, 25 years old. And from a kind of archival standpoint, it's fairly trivial to do that. Now, not so, on the one hand, for stuff that's much older than that. So magnetic tapes, for example, as an older storage format, those are still, I think, generally quite challenging for most archivists. And that's a much more sort of, that's a different kind of enterprise. Likewise, from the early aughts to our present moment starts to get us into the era of course, cloud-based computing. And so there too, I think prospects for archivists are much dicier, not so much for purely technological reasons, but rather for sort of what we might think of as legalistic reasons, societal reasons. I mean, we're only, I think, starting to come to terms with the question of digital legacies. What happens? Can your partner get access to your Google Drive? All those sorts of questions. Those are not fundamentally technological problems to be solved, as perhaps they are in the case of very old magnetic tape systems, but rather they're questions that are the products of license agreements, of laws, intellectual property, and so on. And so there's a different kind of engineering that will be needed in that instance. But Bitstreams takes all of its case studies from what I called that sweet spot, the 1980s, the 1990s, the early aughts, where because you have data stored on physical media that individuals generally kept in their own possession, I think archivists have reasonably good prospects for accessing much of that data. And there's a lot of culturally significant, historically significant material that is captured in that format. So that's the other kind of underlying argument of Bitstreams. One, this argument about materiality, and then two, the argument about the importance of what I called historicizing digital archiving, sort of these periodizing gestures that I mentioned. And the case studies that the book then works with, because I am an English professor, that's what the university pays me to be. That's the day job. My examples are all from the sort of world of essentially literary computing, famous authors who themselves began working with computers like the rest of us sometime in the early 80s or a little bit later than that, dealing with their digital legacies, the material remains of their creative process as captured on various media. And so the bit that I wanted to read concerns Toni Morrison, who I'm going to assume needs no introduction. Toni Morrison, her papers, her literary papers are at Princeton University, so not too far, and it was not difficult to take a day trip up there. So I'm going to read just a little bit from the book to kind of give you a flavor for the prose. Let's see. The chapter that this is drawn from is entitled Archives Without Dust. So I'll read for, maybe about 5 or 8 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions. It's startling to see it on the Dell flat screen set up lengthwise to duplicate the orientation of a sheet of paper. Beloved, a novel by Toni Morrison. Let me zoom in a little bit. These words are typewritten in the center of the badly burned page, barely legible through the discoloration of smoke and water damage. The edges are blackened and irregular. Most of the top left quadrant is scorched away entirely. I'm looking at a high resolution digital image of a hard copy printout of a working draft of the Pulitzer Prize winning book, Beloved. It is one of the manuscripts that survived the house fire that engulfed Toni Morrison's residence on Christmas Day in 1993. So she had a house fire, quite a bad one. The crumbling pages have been conserved and scanned by the Department of Rare Books and Special Collections at Princeton University Library. Here, all access to Morrison's papers, damaged or otherwise, is via digital surrogates viewed at a dedicated workstation in the reading room, network and USB ports disabled. A note in the finding aid informs patrons that this mode of access is by request of the author. Contrary to Carolyn Steadman, whose book Dust you may know, would make a wonderful reading for Cafe if not. Contrary to Carolyn Steadman, there is no dust in this archive, and thus no risk of archive fever, at least not in any epidemiological sense. That's a kind of reference to Jacques Derrida's arguments about archive fever. The haunting digital image in front of me registers as a testament to not only the resilience of paper and ink in the face of fire, smoke, and water, but also to the efficacy of the collective array of memory institutions that ensure that treasures such as this are, in the novel's own parlance, passed on. But as compelling as the fire-damaged page images were, they would not have what had brought me to the archives. Among the 200 linear feet and some 325 boxes of material that comprised Morrison's papers when they were first acquired in 2014 were 150 floppy disks, most of them having passed through the hands of one of Morrison's office assistants. The majority of these were of the 3.5-inch variety, but 33 were in the older, more cantankerous 5.25-inch format. Of these, 4, which is what you see in the image, had been identified as containing files pertaining to Beloved. Despite their being nearly 30 years old, the stored data had proven legible. I was also lucky in that Morrison's assistants had been using a DOS PC running Microsoft Word, so the files were saved in a familiar format, and that the diskettes themselves had been kept at a university office, thereby sparing them from the ravages of the fire. Nonetheless, when opened on the reading room workstation at which I sat, portions of the electronic documents were shot through with junk code, the artifacts of formatting instructions long out of date. Let me try to zoom in. The artifacts of formatting instructions long out of date and thus meaningless to the WordPad application the computer was outfitted then. No dust in this archive then, but instead what is sometimes called bit rot, the inevitable decay of digital information in whatever its stored form. When these glitched electronic documents were juxtaposed with the scanned images of the fire-damaged manuscripts, the screen in front of me bore witness to 2 very different kinds of textual trauma. And I'll just say that this moment, I mean, this is kind of one of those, people often ask me, do you get the same sort of, kind of thrill, the same charge, the same excitement working with legacy digital materials that we do with very old books and manuscripts? And I do, precisely because of moments like this. Even in its digital form, those images, those fire-damaged manuscript images are so powerful. And likewise, accessing electronic files, copies of Beloved's chapters that were typed by Morrison and her assistants and revised, and which are then preserved in their original digital format, and then accessing those, to me, that does convey a kind of similar sense of proximity to the past. So just a little bit more and then I'll stop. If there is no dust in the reading room at the Firestone Library, it is because the digital objects that enable access to the Toni Morrison collection are inured to that most mundane of material accretions. Dust is, after all, the enemy of the digital. It is the reason why microprocessors are manufactured in clean rooms by workers wearing bunny suits. It is why the air in the server rooms at the very best data centers is ionized to purge airborne contaminants. For all of the incontrovertible evidence of the elemental forces that attacked Morrison's papers, visible in astonishingly intimate detail in these high-resolution images, the marks of trauma and distress we see on the screen are simulacra. Indeed, at the deepest of computational levels, the images we see are reconstituted anew each and every time the files are accessed. That's just how computers work. Every time you access a file, in essence, the bit stream is being put together anew. It's being put together as a kind of unique individual instantiation of what the system perceives architecturally as a file. So each time the images we see are reconstituted anew, each and every time the files are accessed, refreshed and reassembled in Gatsby-esque fashion for us to look at with our Dutch sailor's eyes. Bit of a literary flourish there. This is an ontology in which the bit stream is constantly refreshed and renewed with each revolution of a diskette and each migration or update or patch to the server that the staff at the archives undertakes. For that matter, each new budget cycle and org plan and fire marshal's inspection and security audit, each new upgrade to infrastructure and grid, plumbing and HVAC. It doesn't really come through in these few paragraphs I'm reading, but much of the work of this chapter is engaging with the actual research literature of professional archivists. And it focuses not just on technical considerations related to the bit stream and digital preservation, but also the kind of infrastructural considerations I was gesturing out there that enable us to maintain our, in this case, our servers. One more bit. Dust is anathema to the digital, but it is not unlike the stuff of the digital. Barely there, but everywhere. Literally tiny bits of matter. Quote, the minimum recognizable entity of material transformation and circulation, in the words of one writer. But the most compelling way to think about dust, as writers such as Stedman have shown, is not as the simple byproduct of deterioration and decay, but rather as literally revolutionary and regenerative. Dust, Carolyn Stedman says, is about, quote, circularity, the impossibility of things disappearing or going away or being gone, end quote. The historian C.V. Wedgwood, who was not yet 30 years of age when she wrote her great history of the 30 Years' War, understood this. Nothing, Wedgwood wrote, nothing seems to bridge the gap of years like the folding and unfolding of ancient letters, sometimes minute particles of sand which had long adhered in some thick downstroke where the ink had been wet, detach themselves after 300 years to blow away and join with yesterday's dust, end quote. Dusting, like archive, is both a noun and a verb, a Janus word that encompasses acts of both application and removal. There is no dust in the data centers and server farms, it is true, just as there is no real lint among the digital pocket litter collected there. But in their enduring ephemerality, in the gaps between definite and indefinite articles, in the gaps between scarcity and abundance, between non-places and places, memory and storage, and above all, the gaps between one and zeros, we find the cycles of revolution and renewal that are the ontological essence of the bit stream. Thank you. And I'll stop there and see what we have for discussion. Thank you.
Well, Doug's hand has shot right up. So Doug, go for it.
Okay, thanks, Matt. I've got two things to say. One is something about interpretation. So when you were showing that burned page, I was seeing sort of a Grecian statue, or I don't know, some kind of a statue, right? You could see a face on the side of it.
Oh,
and it was quite a long time before I realized that's not what you were showing when you zoomed in on the text. So yes, there is certainly
faces in the clouds. Yeah.
Yeah, there's certainly an active interpretation here. I agree with you on that.
Mm-hmm.
I want to challenge this question of a bit stream as an isolated unit. You've told this story as if the bitstream has a beginning and an end, and it stands apart from other bitstreams that might be, flowing by at the same time.
Yeah.
But when I think about all of these floppy disks you're describing, the full set of floppy disks has relationships among them. And in fact, you're looking at relationships among a scanned object and the original digital object. And it's the relationship you find interesting, right? Yeah. And so I guess I'm going to try to infer that your answer will be, you can look at things at many scales, and looking at it at the scale of a bitstream is interesting. And it's a different book to look at it at the scale of how all these things are related to each other.
Yeah, right. So thanks, Doug. And that's I think, a kind of helpful clarification. So I sometimes describe my, we talk a lot about big data nowadays, and I sometimes tell people that I'm the small data guy. In other words, I'm interested in things like floppy diskettes, where you've got precisely 140 kilobytes. And that's an amount of data which, in the space of an afternoon and a strong pot of coffee and a good hex editor, right, you could go through that sector by sector in the same way that one of my colleagues might spend an afternoon at the Library of Congress going through an old manuscript page by page, right? We can sort of inspect the bitstream in that microscopic forensic way that has certain analogs, I would argue, to more traditional forms of, in this instance, what I've been calling bibliographical research. Now, having said that, what interested me about the Morrison and that visit to Princeton, the question that I really went there to answer, is whether there was data in the form of versions of the book chapters on the floppy disks that differed from the versions of the manuscript materials that were captured in those high-resolution scans. Now, this is another tangent of the chapter. I was likewise fascinated by the way in which both the high-resolution scans and the chapters that I was pulling off of the floppy disks, right, both of those are themselves bitstreams, although there is no interoperability between them, right? There's no way to kind of automate the comparison between the digital images on the one hand and those glitched patchwork chapters I was reading on the other hand. And that, I think, gets to your point about the sort of self-contained nature of the bitstream. Sometimes I would argue it is self-contained and discrete because of the difficulties we encounter with the interoperability between different kinds of formats and data structures. Not everything is sort of endlessly intermeshed and interoperable merely by virtue of being digital. And that's actually another kind of facet of the argument. But what I really wanted to try to kind of unpack was whether let's say I'm not a Toni Morrison scholar, that's not my sort of vocation, but let's say a colleague of mine who was, they really wanted to kind of understand her creative process. Would it be enough for them to merely consult those high-resolution manuscript images and make a careful study of those in the ways that literary scholars have been accustomed to doing for a long time? Or would they also need to delve into the born digital materials, these data fragments, these remnants of the original word processed files? And so in that sense, I was very much interested in, I think you used that kind of image of a network, the kind of way in which, even though functionally, technically, the data was not interoperable, clearly it exists in a kind of networked relationship to the full kind of textual landscape, if you will, that constituted all of the many different drafts and versions of Beloved before it reached its final printed form. And not to sort of give away the game, but the answer, as you might guess, is yes. I did find, and in some rather famous portions of the book, versions of the text that, to the best of my knowledge and ability, seemed only to exist in the digital form, in the sort of word processed born digital format. And that is documented in the book. And so in that sense, it's a contribution to literary studies, but it also, I think, demonstrates precisely that future scholars will need to consult, if they're working on an author who was themselves working on a computer, they will need to consult that author's sort of digital remnants and files as well as their material ones.
Let me just say that I also love your point about it being locked down. And it's not interoperable precisely because of a policy decision to make it locked down, because I could OCR the other thing and you know, have some alignment algorithm. You could imagine maybe it's not interoperable today, but maybe 20 years from now.
And there's a long footnote about OCR, and yes, you know, this too is a kind of research frontier. But
we're preventing that as a policy matter by locking down the digital side.
Well, I think we should move on to other questions, but just to distinguish, yes, absolutely, there's a policy question here in terms of the way that workstation was set up. One could ask, why did I need to go to Princeton and sit there in the reading room? Why shouldn't I be able to do that from my living room? That's a policy question we can talk about, but there are also technological regimens of that also prohibit that kind of interoperability. So again, the image data is structured in very different ways from the legacy Word documents, and there's no obvious or sort of at least push button way to allow those bit streams to cross and interoperate. I'm not saying it couldn't be done given world enough and time and sufficient funding and resources and so on, but at least at a kind of practical, in sort of a practical everyday sense, there is no interoperability between different kinds of bit streams I encountered. And that is, I think that does speak to kind of the way in which everything digital is a 1 or a 0. Yes, that doesn't mean that it is all functionally equivalent.
Thank you.
Jason, you've put a message in the chat. Do you want to unmute and read that out?
No. That's just a one-off observation of mine about, I don't own any Bitcoin, so I don't lose sleep over losing them. But Matthew, great to hear from you. I wonder though, your fascination with CDs and other sort of electronic media, are we in a transitional era? I know archives, smaller archives around the world and larger archives too, are struggling with digitizing stuff and pulling stuff out of CDs and other forms of media, backup tapes, whatever. It seems to me that we're moving to a world where you don't have electronic objects of any kind. You don't even have current laptops that will, you can plug in a USB stick to. And so are we in this world? Do you see a world of 2040 where we're not worrying about pulling the bit stream out of these kind of objects?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. And again, that's why I see this kind of chronological or historical, again, I keep referring to it as a kind of sweet spot, roughly the last quarter or 20 years of the 20th century into the early years of the 21st century, where we have, fairly stable, very well documented storage formats and devices like diskettes and CDs and hard drives. But we have, of course, begun transitioning to the so-called cloud. Now, we know that the cloud so-called is really everything that we think of as being up in the cloud. It really just means it's on somebody else's hard drive somewhere else that you yourself don't have hands-on access to. So this is why I think the challenge is, if we kind of stratify different historical moments, we're going to need new tools, new approaches, new strategies to digital preservation, starting, whenever you want to date the advent of the cloud from sometime in the mid-aughts, where the questions, the challenges for the archivist are not going to be necessarily technical questions related to data migration and I've got this 8-inch floppy disk and how the heck am I going to scrape bits off of it, but rather questions that bring us back to those policy questions Doug was referring to, where a scenario in which an author of Toni Morrison's stature, for example, has passed without any form of digital will or legacy. And we know that they were, let's say we know that they worked in Google Drive and that there are precious unpublished manuscripts that are kind of sitting there in their Google Drive, but there's no provision for access to them. And so it's not a technological challenge. It's going to be a kind of a policy challenge, a legal challenge, obviously an ethical challenge. What are the ethics of that? If we knew Shakespeare had a Google Drive somewhere, but had left behind no directives, no will concerning access to it for posterity, should archivists be able to kind of get at that? I mean, what are the ethical considerations there? And so these are all the kinds of questions that we are facing. It's not hypothetical.
Thanks. I don't know whether Shakespeare had a Google Drive, but the person who wrote all his plays probably did. Yeah. Okay.
Travis, over to you.
Yeah, Matt, thank you. That was a wonderful book talk. My question is more, I think, about the ethics of researchers here. So one of the things I think about a lot is like queer history, and you talked about magnetic media, right? So much of it was recorded on like videotape. And there's, at least in the threads of like queer archival theory, like the desire to touch and connect with history in a very embodied way. So I'll talk to researchers a lot and they'll be like, oh, I found this VHS tape and I watched it. And it's got this super rare AIDS HIV footage. And I'm like, cool, did you digitize it? And they're like, no, that's not my job. And it's like, you might have destroyed that tape while watching it, right? And so I'll sort of like try to get folks to think about these sort of ethics when you're doing that type of marginalized history, if it's on this sort of like medium that is going to destroy itself just by existing or being used, right? To bring it into a sort of digital conversation. So I guess my question is twofold, because first, your talks really challenged me to think about that as a viable solution, right? Because it's going to reproduce those sort of problems, right? Like if there's not a constant concern for that history being preserved, not necessarily digitized, but also how you might see any sort of marginalized history reproducing some of these challenges in a completely digital world.
Yeah, thanks for that. There's one kind of, I guess, sort of touchstone for that in the preservation landscape is the notion of an image in the sense of a disk image, a hardware image. So not a picture, not a pictorial image, but an image as a bitstream, an image as a complete capture of the ones and zeros that exist on some particular piece of media. And there's an argument there's been an argument for some years in the preservation community that best practice consists in making a disk image, right? So you get the hard drive. The first thing that you do is you go and you get the image so that you've separated the bits from their physical medium, and whatever policy decisions you make down the road, you've ensured the sanctity of that bit stream. You've captured a complete record. And for a lot of years, I subscribed to that. It seemed obvious to me. Yeah, go and get the image, right? Just, it's the first thing you do, and you can figure out everything else later. Then I've come to question that more recently for a bunch of reasons. As a general practice, I think it's still often a good idea, and one desires the disk image. But there are questions related to the ethics of that kind of sort of dissociation of the bit stream from the artifact that has been its conveyor. There are questions about data privacy. So once you are sort of the happy owner, if you will, of a disk image, a bitstream, you are also its custodian. And there are, even if you're sort of keeping the images in a so-called dark archive, even if the notion is that you're going to sequester them on some server with no public access, you still have responsibility for them and for whatever personal information is there. There are finally ecological questions. So like you've got, a 20 terabyte hard drive with a handful of Microsoft Word files on it. Well, you go and image the whole thing anyway, right? Because, why not? Well, 20 terabytes is space in a data center somewhere. And we're now asking, I think, important questions about the ecological footprint of those data centers and also labor practices that attend them. So all of which is to say that, for me, I think thinking about, I don't feel like I'm ready to necessarily characterize this or that as a kind of queer archival practice, but I think thinking about the disk image in particular as kind of the focal point, the locus of the archivist's work, that's been under pressure, I think, in some interesting ways in recent years, and it's certainly altered my own thinking a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was great.
Matt, we have a question from Gregory in the chat. Gregory, do you want to unmute and read it out, or we're fine, or have one of us read out?
Oh, I see I see the question.
Please just go ahead and go at it. You don't, if you want me to read it out loud, I'm happy to do that. But I'm eating lunch. I'm in LA, so.
So the short answer is, that kind of scenario that you sketch. That's kind of like a big chocolate sundae dessert for me. In other words, that's sort of how I would want to ideally spend my days, sifting this digital dust from the hard drives of famous writers and discovering all kinds of intriguing and wonderful things about their creative process, and spinning up new interpretations of the ending of Beloved because of something I found in these old word processing, right? There's this is always, I think, going to be a specialized kind of practice within literary studies as its own professionalized field. Not every one of my colleagues over in the English department will be doing that, but I certainly think some of them will if they are scholars of more contemporary material. And as I said, they're going to have to take that digital dust into account alongside of other sort of more familiar kinds of both bibliographical and biographical information that we associate with a particular author. It's just going to have to become part of what we think about when we try to kind of use the material remnants of somebody's personal archive to kind of find our way a little bit into their thinking, into their creative process, into their literary imagination. So this is the marketing moment. Bitstreams aspires to be a set of case studies that kind of so the Tony Morrison is one. There are others that kind of walks you through some of those scenarios that you're describing, Greg.
Thank you. For me, it's interesting because there's always this debate about Dickinson and the interpretation of her funny punctuation and kind of a restoration of that punctuation, but it always remains a place of ambiguity, which is an invitation to scholars like you to come in and do an interpretive work and find significance in those things. But it seems to me that those funny little gremlins, and we've seen them in all sorts of different files, and sometimes prevent software from opening up those files in routine ways. When you think about Shannon's rubric, it's not clear whether those funny glyphs are part of the, I mean, they're clearly part of the original text.
They're the noise.
But I think Shannon would shift them and describe them as noise, and that ambiguity I think is interesting as well.
Yeah, so maybe, I mean, to clarify, and maybe I can see if I can briefly reshare my screen. Bear with me for 1 sec. So the glyphs. So what are these glyphs? And these are not. This is not sort of. Now you can imagine a scenario where a writer is doing interesting, and there are scenarios. I mean, there are sort of examples of contemporary writers who are doing precisely this kind of literary experiment, using different kinds of sort of symbols that are available to us on our keyboards or through our word processors, or certainly emoji on social media, using these in an expressive way to sort of, ornament, decorate, augment their writing in some fashion. This is not that. This is actual bit rot. What it is more specifically, I believe, this is my sort of forensic hypothesis. I believe there are formatting instructions here. I believe this is perhaps a page break. So these are moments where the original Microsoft Word document is almost but not quite fully compatible with the WordPad application that is on the reading station. And so some of the trickier parts of the file structure, like the formatting code, so we get most of the ASCII text, but some of the trickier parts of the file structure do not render properly, and in its place you get this junk code. Now there's a kind of interesting question. So clearly what we see here is not the product of anybody's intentional agency, like neither Morrison or anybody else is sort of making deliberative creative decisions about this junk code. There's, one could still sort of argue, I mean, Beloved is a text that's all about sort of the trauma of memory. What does it mean to kind of think about this junk code, which is the product of a certain kind of trauma around memory and storage? What does it mean to think of that thematically in relation to the original novel, even though, it quite clearly is not the product of anybody's, actual intentionality?
Thank you.
Somebody just jumping in? No, maybe. Okay. So we are just about to reach the 5 o'clock mark. We've had a wonderful discussion, but I wanted to give anybody who has one last lingering question a chance to jump in before we let Matt go. Matt, I'm definitely going to be sending you an email with various follow-up after this, but that was so great. Doug, are you unmuting?
Oh, no, I'm just waiting for the end so I can say thanks, Matt. I mean,
okay.
if you want, I'd keep us going for another half hour. We can talk about Baudot code, which
I think between us, yeah, we could
you
keep
probably
that
don't want to
here
do
until
that.
tomorrow.
That sounds like good fun to me.
Well, I am going to torture you all by asking one last question because I can't not. I'm curious about whether there are any existing glossaries essentially for if you find this gobbledygook, it was probably this format or this text or this whatever and should be rendered as such. And I imagine there are many, many permutations of that. Are there emerging shared practice around that?
Yeah, not to my knowledge. I mean, nothing quite so sort of like formalized as like a glossary or a dictionary. I mean, I think where so for a question, my instinct as a practitioner, if I had a question like that, I would try to find a kind of, maybe like a retro computing group or people interested in the history of Microsoft Word and file formats, and post the question there where folks with some real sort of deep expertise might be able to answer very particular questions about file structures and what's happening to kind of the the rendering of the file in a more recent application. I think something like, a quote unquote glossary is a great idea. I think, I guess I'm not even sure where you would start. I mean, it would just be an enormous kind of undertaking. But I think more generally, just helping people who may be non-expert sort of, there's a tendency when we see that stuff on our screen, we just kind of look past it and say, oh, something went wrong. Well, I don't have to pay attention to this. I think, sometimes looking at what went wrong can be really generative. And sometimes that's like your way in. And so, I think at least, training folks not to just kind of read past that, skip past that, but to ask questions about, well, why is that there? What did go wrong? What can this tell me about the artifact, right? Those, I think, are really valuable questions.
Thank you so much. And also thank you, Travis, for sharing a link to AV Artifact Atlas in the chat here. So yeah, lots of fizzing ideas and generative ways forward, I'm sure. Let's give Matt another round of applause. Thank you so much. And this recording will be made available on the Cafe YouTube shortly.
Thank you all. That was a lot of fun. And I've been doing a bunch of book events, and this was a really good discussion. So thank you all.
Great, thank you.
Thanks so much.